4, 3, 2, 1.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 102nd episode of The Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Anju Grossman. My friends know me as JAG. I am the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways like graphic novels and animated videos. Today, we are joined by Jakob Mchangama. Before I even get into introducing him, I wanted to remind all of you who are joining us, watching us on Zoom, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, use the comment section to type in your questions. Go ahead and jump in right now and get first in the queue. We'll get to as many of them as we can. So Jakob Mchangama is a Danish lawyer and human rights advocate whose commentary has appeared frequently in outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and Foreign Affairs. He is the founder and director of Justicia, a Copenhagen-based think tank focused on human rights. He is, most importantly, the author of Free Speech, a history from Socrates to social media. Jakob, welcome again. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jack. Pleasure to be invited on. I look forward to our chat.
So first, our audience would love to hear a little bit about you, where you grew up, what influenced you, and what inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, so I was born here in Copenhagen, Denmark. Had spent most of my life here with stints around other countries, including in the US. And growing up in a very secular, liberal country like Denmark, I didn't think too much about free speech. Like many other people, I just took it for granted as a value that was sort of settled. But then Denmark became sort of the epicenter of a global battle of values over the relationship between free speech and religion, when in 2005, a Danish newspaper published cartoons depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad, and that led to sort of a huge outcry, boycott attempts against Denmark, terrorist attacks on journalists and editors, and that has sort of a conflict which is still ongoing, which is intimately linked to the later attack on French magazine Charlie Hebdo, where a dozen or so journalists and employees were murdered by religious fanatics. And so that really got me interested in the whole topic of free speech. What does it mean? Where does this right come from? Why is it so difficult to be principled about it? Why do people change their mind about the value of free speech according to their underlying values? What does it mean when a society has free speech, when it loses free speech, when it's never had free speech? I think that trying to understand the present through the prism of the past is sometimes very useful. So that's what I try to do first with the podcast, Clear and Present Danger: A History of Free Speech, which I finished back in 2020, and then the book is sort of an attempt to pull all of that together and write it in a hopefully compelling way.
Which I think you have succeeded in doing. And as I was mentioning before we got on, I particularly enjoyed the Audible version with an excellent narrator. I remember the Charlie Hebdo attack very clearly. I was in Paris at the time, so it felt very real to me. So with this book and studying free speech throughout history, you delineate elite speech and egalitarian speech, and I understand that's something that you hadn't necessarily really categorized in the past. So what is that distinction historically, I guess going back to ancient Greece, really, and how is that distinction playing out today?
Yes, I think that's a very important and recurrent theme throughout the history of free speech. So I think free speech originates in the Athenian democracy. and so had around 2,500 years of going back in time, where the Athenians had two overlapping concepts of free speech. One of them was isagoria, meaning equality of speech. So that was political speech that all freeborn male citizens could exercise in the assembly, where they voted under their direct democracy, voted and discussed laws. But then they also had a broader concept called parousia, which means something like uninhibited speech, which permeated their culture. So it was tolerant of social dissent. We all know the history of Socrates, who was executed for his opinions, but he had for decades been allowed to roast people in humiliating intellectual Q&As in the agora, the marketplace in Athens. And you could poke fun of the high and mighty. You could even poke fun of the gods. So while there was not absolute free speech, it was significantly freer than contemporary societies, and especially sort of more oligarchic societies. And then you also had free speech in the Roman Republic, which originates later on. But there you have a more elitist top-down free speech tradition. So one in which the well-educated, wealthier elite are the ones that exercise primarily free speech, and where the plebs, the commoners, are seen as not being worthy of participating in public discussions and too dangerous to allow to have any real political power. So even though Roman citizens could cast votes in various assemblies, they didn't have a right to address them and speak the way that ordinary Athenians had. And I think that those two clashing concepts or competing concepts of free speech, we see them play out again and again throughout the history of free speech, especially when you have new technological developments or political developments that expand the public sphere by providing a voice to previously marginalized or ostracized groups. So it could be with the printing press. Suddenly, you're able to disseminate information publications to a much wider audience than before, and it has wide-ranging consequences for politics and religion in Europe. And of course, today we see it very much with the internet and social media. So even though, in principle, before the internet, everyone enjoyed an individual right to free speech on an equal basis, de facto, there was a privileged elite that acted as institutional gatekeepers. So if you were an ordinary citizen, if you would have a very slim chance of really addressing the public sphere unless an editor gave you a platform by admitting you onto a newspaper or a TV program, or if you were a journalist, or if you were sort of a prominent politician or intellectual. That changed with the internet and social media, and that now we also again see that institutional gatekeepers who were used to shape and filter the public debate are extremely worried about the consequences of disinformation and hate speech and other types of speech that they fear will sort of lead astray the masses. And it's true that there are harms and costs involved in free speech, but as we may get back to, I tend to look at the history of free speech as supporting the idea that until now, the benefits of free speech outweigh the harms and costs.
You coined a phrase, Milton's curse, in your book to describe, I believe, the selective and unprincipled defense of free speech. What inspired the attribution to the poet Milton, and what are some contemporarily of this kind of selective bias and how we apply the principle of free speech?
Yeah, so John Milton is not only famous for sort of Paradise Lost in his poetry, but he also wrote in 1644 the Areopagitica, which was a very eloquently written defense of press freedom and an attack on the institution of pre-publication censorship. And so that means a lot of people laud John Milton as being sort of an early defender of press freedom and free speech. But when you read more carefully, you see that that Milton is actually not advocating press freedom for Catholics. He's also, fine with book burnings if they're sort of too critical of religion or seditious. He later supports a very draconian blasphemy ban, and the ultimate irony is that he ends up serving as a censor under Cromwell, who sort of led a semi-military dictatorship in the 1640s. So that's why I coined the term Milton's curse. And we see that again and again. Someone like Voltaire is often credited with being a free speech absolutist, but he very much was in favor of elite free speech and also tried to sort of sometimes point the French rigorous censorship system under the old regime in the direction of authors that he didn't like or compete with. And you see it with the founding generation in America. So someone like John Adams in 1765 rails against the British attempts to sort of put duties on printing material, and says that this is an attempt by the British to impose slavery on the colonists. And then when he becomes president, Congress adopts the Sedition Act, which basically is an attempt to protect himself and his Federalist Party from criticism from the Democratic Republican competitors or opponents. And you have Hamilton and George Washington on board with this. So it's basically something that you see again, and you see it now to even today, where I saw a tweet by Hillary Clinton recently saying that she was in favor of a recently adopted European law regulating social media that obliges social media platforms to remove illegal content. She was very much in favor of that, though that, if that was to be adopted in the US, that would mean an obligation to remove a lot of material that would be protected by the First Amendment. But you could also have the whole sort of culture wars in America. So, you can have conservatives who rail about cancel culture, and then they'll support politicians who adopt laws against critical race theory that would sort of put limits on what colleges and universities can say and teach. So it's just, unfortunately, I think hardwired into human beings that principles are extremely difficult, and that we are very good at coming up with reasons why the free speech is important, but we need limits, and those limits magically tend to be in line with our own ideological preferences, and that hence we can convince ourselves that they're not really limitations on free speech.
I see. All right, I have a few more questions, but I just wanted to remind everybody in the audience, this is a wonderful opportunity to ask questions of really one of the world's leading foremost experts on free speech, its history, and its importance. So go in there, type in your questions. We're going to get to them. Jakob, you have said that we are in a global free speech recession. How do you measure that? And what are the trends that are driving it?
Yeah, so, if you want to take a more positive look, you could say that we're in a certain sense living in a golden age, because, free speech has never been enjoyed stronger legal protection under the First Amendment, for instance, in the US. And free speech is a global international human rights norm, and just technology allows, you're sitting in California, I'm sitting in Copenhagen, we're having a frank discussion. I can criticize American politicians. There's no censorship at all. So that, is an exercise of free speech, although I think both you and I just take it for granted. This is part of what we do. We don't think of it as exercising free speech. We don't feel like dissidents when we're having this discussion. But then on the other hand, I would say that the golden age may be in decline. And why do I say that? Well, because in general, there's a tendency of more and more restrictive laws being adopted. And that's not surprising in authoritarian states like Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so on. But increasingly, we also see it in liberal democracies in Europe, where hate speech, disinformation, illegal content on social media. The European Union now banning Russian disinformation from broadcasting in Europe, and even demanding that certain Russian information be removed by social media platforms. So even if you want to counter it, you can't necessarily share it on your own social media profile if you're in Europe. And then there's a culture of free speech, which in many ways may be more important than legal protections, or at least a necessary precondition for having robust legal protections. And I think that's the main worry in the US. It might not so much be the law, because in the short and medium term, the First Amendment seems to be in very safe hands with the current Supreme Court, which puts a lot of emphasis on free speech. But long term, you have a tendency where especially younger and more progressive Americans view free speech as a threat to minorities and to tolerance, and so they tend to put less emphasis on free speech, might even see it as being weaponized against tolerance and democracy. And then you have a backlash or a counter reaction from conservatives that I described in this attempt to then sort of ban various types of speech that they don't like and that they see as undermining the values that they hold in high regard. I think that's a dangerous development, because if the culture of free speech in the United States deteriorates, then ultimately the First Amendment is also likely to be less robust in its protection. The First Amendment was ratified in 1791. The wording hasn't changed, but throughout its history, there's been a lot of speech that Supreme Court justices were completely indifferent to, or were perfectly fine with being punished, and punished severely, that would be protected today. So it's not an iron law that the First Amendment will continue to enjoy the same robust protection that it does today. And I think, especially in a very polarized America, I think if the robust protection at the legal level was to break down, I think you would see, a bit like maybe, dare I mention the topic of abortion these days, but the way that, certain parts of the country would have laws that prohibited certain types of speech reflecting their underlying values, and other parts in the country where so in certain countries it might be, you'd have laws that would make it more difficult for Black Lives Matter to have militant protests in the streets, and others where the NRA could not really protest because you'd have certain types of laws targeting that. Might be laws where it would be a crime to burn the Stars and Stripes and so on. And I think that would be a nightmare scenario. Imagine you being in California and you write something, and then you travel to Alabama, and then you're arrested because you wrote something that was legal in California but was prohibited in Alabama, or vice versa. So that would be my
vice versa in my case.
Yeah. So that's why I see sort of a free speech recession, which unfortunately, it's a bit paradoxical again, because we have social media and the internet. We have better ways than ever before to actually express ourselves, but then the limits on what we can actually say are also sort of becoming more less permissive, if you like.
Right. I mean, between the tweet that you'd mentioned from Hillary Clinton, and then former President Barack Obama coming out and making really an alarming and strident case for more censorship, more moderation, more control online. And all of this is happening, as you mentioned, when we have protesters in front of the Supreme Court calling for packing the court, adding more politically appointed Supreme Court justices to kind of move towards the kind of decisions that they'd like. So it is alarming. And on that note, I am going to dive into some of our questions here. My good friend Scott Schiff asks if Jakob has heard about the Biden administration's plan to create a disinformation governance board under the aegis of the Department of Homeland Security. So this would be a board with
Yeah,
police.
but from what I understood, it's been almost impossible to get any coherent response as to what its powers actually were, and I think that under the First Amendment, its powers to limit to take any sort of action, concrete action against concrete speech would be very, very limited. Not least due to New York Times versus Sullivan, the 1964 decision, which a lot of people forget was actually a civil rights decision. And as an aside, many of the very robust protections and expansions of the First Amendment were landmark civil rights decisions. It's unclear to me what this board will actually try to do, but it seems to me that it could not really do anything restrictive, but it sounds sort of dystopian. The name itself, in and of itself, is I think should be a no-no in an open democracy. This is not to say that disinformation cannot lead to harms, or that free speech does not come with harms and costs. It does, but I think sometimes we make sort of the logical fallacy of saying, oh, some certain types of speech may cause harms, but and then say, well, then we have to prohibit it. But it does not follow from the fact that certain speech may entail harms that prohibiting that type of speech is an efficient solution, and or B, would not result in unintended negative consequences that were worse than allowing that type of speech to be published. And of course, there are all kinds of alternative, non-restrictive measures you can use to combat disinformation. I mean, that's the whole point of having an open democracy, is that we can discuss and debate certain issues. It's not that we're trying to provide one side of the debate with a club with which to beat its opponents into silence.
I think part of the problem that I have is not just the establishment of this board, which I find very concerning, but the use now, the ubiquity of the term disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. Like I didn't even know that was a word. And they're just kind of anti-concepts. I mean, things are either true or they're false, and labeling something as disinformation is a judgment call. And is that judgment going to be made by the government, and how is it going to be implemented?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and that's why from the Catholic Church to Henry VIII to the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany, all of these institutions and states had laws against false information that were used, of course, to protect the rulers and leaders who got to define and enforce those definitions. From battling heresy in the Middle Ages to enemies of the people under Lenin and Hitler. So I agree. It's a nebulous category, and almost inevitably will be weaponized in a certain way, and also very often, who you might not be able to. So COVID is a good example. So we're trying to understand a brand new virus and countering it while we still don't have a full picture of what it means, and then trying to then sort of say what's the truth about it, it becomes very difficult, and ultimately I think contributes to erode trust in health authorities if they go out and make very robust statements, and then it turns out that they might have believed at a certain point this is the best available science, but then researchers in another place of the world comes to a different conclusion, and then you have to revise, as you do all the time when it comes to science. And so in many ways, trying to sort of combat scientific misinformation, for instance, I think is extremely counterproductive in many ways. Also, just because you can point to a lot of here in Denmark, our health authorities, to their credit, admitted that they had made several calls that were wrong in hindsight. I think that actually increases trust in institutions, that they admit to their mistakes, because otherwise that's sort of you basically feed the conspiracy theories about Bill Gates and 5G towers and all the rest of that.
Well, I was going to save that question to the last, but we were just talking before we began the webinar about the guest that I had 2 weeks ago, Johan Anderberg, and his book Heard on Sweden's experience. So what were the mistakes that they admitted to? Because here in the United States, the CDC has yet to admit to any mistakes.
Yeah, so for instance, in February, when I guess it was in February or January, February. First of all, they said, there's no signs that this is going to turn into a pandemic, and then they said, yeah, sure, Danes, why don't you go on skiing in Austria where there had been outbreaks? It's not really a danger. And then they, Danes went, they got infected, and it became sort of a super spreader event that really set off the epidemic here. Then, changing guidelines about, changing, I think also something about whether asymptomatic spread. I think they got stuff wrong on that. On face masks, they got stuff wrong on that. And again, it's not because they were engaged in a conspiracy theory to deceive the Danish population. It's just that they probably didn't know better, and or they had to come down on one side of conflicting information, and that's why you can't make an authoritative case, because you might not know. And I'm sure when future generations look back on COVID and how we handled it and how we understood COVID, there might be a lot of things where they thought, oh my God, how they were so naive. The same way that, we might look back at how they handled the Spanish flu at the time, and there were certain things that they got right, and there were other things that they completely misunderstood. And that's likely to be the same story.
All right. Well, I'm not going to drag you off onto one of my hobby horses, and I want to get back to the book. And we have a question here from Instagram, Marcus Abbott, asking, who in general do you think are the free speech's biggest heroes and its greatest villains? So who are some of the characters who have primary roles in your book?
Yeah, and so if we look at history, I think one of my favorites is Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and orator. I think his 1860 a plea for free speech in Boston is one of the strongest, shortest cases ever made for free speech, and I think it talks very much to some contemporary issues, and it also shows, I think, why the idea that free speech entrenches unequal power relations and is a threat to minorities is wrong. And Frederick Douglass saw that very clear. He said that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. And I think that has a lot of truth in it. I also like George Orwell. I thought George Orwell was good because he actually, he was anti-totalitarian. But he saw the dangers both the left and the right. But he spent a lot of time sort of going up against his own. So he was on the left. He was a democratic socialist, but he was extremely hostile to communists and saw clearly the totalitarianism of communism and the attempt to sort of police speech by doctrinaire communists. And I think that was extremely important that someone take up that. I think James Madison wrote a very convincing argument against the Sedition Act in his report of 1800, which made a very strong case for a robust commitment to free speech under the First Amendment. And the Levelers, sort of an almost forgotten group of English radicals from the 1640s, who in many ways, I think they're sort of a advancing ideas that would more than 100 years later become part of the American constitutional experiment, sort of their idea of democracy, of universal tolerance, of robust free speech. So I think they are some of the heroes. Ida B. Wells is another, probably never been a braver journalist than Ida B. Wells, who founded a newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech, who went around the South documenting lynchings and showing that the standard defense of lynchings often was that, white women had been raped by black men. And so she showed that many times this was, white women having consensual sex with blacks, and that was not a message that was appreciated by white Southerners. And so a campaign of incitement was aimed against her. Her newspaper was destroyed, and she had to flee. But I think she really she fought hard and used free speech in practice to advance some important causes. So lots of other important figures, but those are some of my favorite ones.
Heroes. What about villains?
Oh, how long do you got?
Give me your top three.
That's the entire history of human history.
Yes.
I think that the default position is
buy
to
this
be,
book.
yeah, is to be critical. I think until Xi Jinping sort of used artificial intelligence and sort of modern communications technology to try and sort of superimpose censorship all over Chinese society. I think Stalin might have been the worst censor in human history and the most repressive. So it's not only that he happily signed the death sentence of political opponents, but it was just like he acted as a censor himself. He would read books, he would read plays, he would manuscripts, and he would screen films and be extremely engaged in it, while at the same time sort of building an extremely repressive state. So Stalin would certainly be among the top of the worst of the worst.
All right, no, we'll get no disagreement here. Question coming in from Facebook. Jeremy C is asking, do you think there are parallels between those two speech freedoms? Maybe he's talking about the elitist and egalitarian kind that you were describing in Athens and Rome, and how big tech tries to suppress certain views on social media.
Yeah, I think, the internet and sort of the early Silicon Valley culture was very much based on egalitarian free speech. So, I don't know if you look up, maybe you're familiar with John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace from 1996. So it's this sort of extremely civil libertarian vision of the internet, a completely boundaryless. Basically, states have no power in building a completely new techno-utopian society with no limits whatsoever, or whatever limits would at least be decided by ordinary people themselves, and not in any way shape governments. And so that was a very decentralized, radical model of free speech that dominated the internet early on. And then, that sort of continued. The internet, I think, was still quite horizontal when you had the blogosphere. You had a lot of different blogs. No one would really care how they were content moderated, because no single blog would in itself affect the entire ecosystem of information and opinion online. And so whether there were neo-Nazi blogs or whatever, you could just avoid them. But then, you move into our current era, which is much more centralized, which has become platformized, if you like. And so suddenly decisions made by Facebook that has around 3 billion users tend to have an actual real effect on free speech, even though, maybe Ayn Rand would say, well, it doesn't matter because it's a private company. So, private property trumps any free speech consideration. They can do whatever they want. But I think that, in my opinion, the culture of free speech is about more than the relationship between individual and government. That is also something stressed by John Stuart Mill and Tocqueville and Orwell and Frederick Douglass. So even though I would not argue that you should sort of adopt a law that would oblige Facebook or Twitter or others to uphold First Amendment standards, for instance, I still think there are good grounds to criticize the way that they do content moderation. Although I also acknowledge that it's impossible to do well, and that you're never going to be able to satisfy everyone, and that you will make a lot of mistakes. But I think it does have an impact on the ecosystem of freedom of speech and information, and has moved to much a more elitist vision. It's still, I think, to a very large extent egalitarian in the sense that everyone can set up their account, but it's clear that there's been a lot of pushback by governments, by traditional media and others to try and have more control on what is being said and shared on these big platforms.
Got it. All right, Ginger Snap 56. I think he just answered pretty much your question. So going back to Facebook, Carl Phillips asks, what do you think about concerns about fake news and how journalists might be self-undermining trust and support for a free press? Now, that's an interesting question, because I know you've had criticism that former President Trump, who that was one of his favorite themes, to kind of make fun of and criticize the press for their bias. But you voiced some concerns that those attacks could undermine support for free speech. But Paul is kind of asking the opposite. The side point.
I think, and here I'm thinking about America, that to a large extent, traditional media has become much more polarized and sort of partisan, which I think undermines the position of the press. However, I don't think that justifies the rhetoric and behavior of and it's not just that Donald Trump would call call journalists enemies of the people, sort of mimicking Lenin rhetoric. It's also that he actually wanted to introduce laws that would punish people, journalists that he thought were saying were lying or writing wrong things. But he was prevented to do so by the First Amendment. So even though he wanted to, he couldn't do it. But obviously, I think it's important to be extremely critical of the media and not, unquestioningly believe everything that is written in the New York Times, and be aware of the biases of traditional media. And that's what you can actually do with social media and the internet. You can, and that's, I think, also what some traditional media resent, the fact that they can be openly questioned. Before, they could get away with a lot of things, because where are you going to voice your critique? Are you going to say, if you write a letter to the editor of New York Times telling how they got things wrong? Well, that might not be published, and even if it did, it might just be 100 words and not be displayed very prominently. Now the criticism is there, it can go viral, and that's, I think most of us are not very happy about criticism, and are uncomfortable with criticism, and will, even if we say that we're in favor of free speech and so on, might be tempted to try and use various methods to suppress criticism of ourselves so that it doesn't get out in the public.
All right, we've got about 20 more minutes. We're going to have many more questions than we have time for, but I'm going to prioritize the question, our audience questions rather than my own. I am going to ask that our team post links, because Jakob had mentioned Frederick Douglass. I'd love to post a link in the comments to My Name is Frederick Douglass, our animated Draw My Life video of him, as well as My Name is Free Speech. Okay, going back to Instagram, James Cummings asks, how does a free speech culture work in Europe compared to something enshrined in the US Constitution? And maybe in answering that, you could also cover the concerns that you addressed in your Wall Street Journal op-ed on why you felt that moves to further ban hate speech by the European Union could actually backfire.
Yeah, so of course it's important to be clear that there's not a sort of unified culture of free speech in Europe. Europe is a lot of things. Even among the 27 member states of the European Union, there are various free speech cultures and free speech tradition. Denmark tends traditionally to be one of the more permissive, liberal in its classical word understanding of free speech, and one that tended more, not completely towards viewpoint neutrality, but pretty much so. Unlike Germany, for instance, in Denmark, you can engage in Holocaust denial. Swastikas are not banned. We've had Nazi radio stations and Nazi political parties, and so on. And I think also, for instance, we don't have in Denmark anything near the same debates and toxic atmosphere at universities that you deal with in the US, and not all, and also there are things that could be written or said that are not banned in the US, but that might not, that a traditional media would not publish. I don't think any of the major newspapers publish the cartoons, for instance. A lot of Danish newspapers won't do it either, but that's because that's basically out of security concerns. Having said that, as I mentioned, laws are being adopted. So Germany is a classic example because of their past. They interpret their past because of the rise of Nazism, the collapse of the Weimar Republic, to include an obligation to be intolerant of intolerance, if you like, and that's a model called Milton democracy. So basically, democracy should be aggressive when it comes to the enemies of democracy, and ban them proactively. As I argue in the book, that is based on what might be called the Weimar fallacy, because it actually, when you look at the history of the Weimar Republic, lasting from 1918 to 1933, is that they had a lot of speech restrictive laws. It's true that they also had constitutional protections of free speech, but for instance, the radio was censored. Nazis and communists could not be on air. Adolf Hitler was banned from speaking in various states, and because of all the political violence, because of the polarization, there were more. The Constitution allowed the president to adopt these emergency measures and have emergency powers. So for instance, the government could administratively ban newspapers for up to 8 weeks if they spread false information or extremism. And leading Nazis were imprisoned for sort of anti-Semitic excesses. And all of this did not seem to prevent the Nazis from gaining popularity. In many ways, they used it very cleverly to to gain more attention, to post themselves as martyrs. And I think most worryingly is that the Nazis actually used the emergency laws of the Weimar Republic, the very laws that were supposed to protect democracy. They used those laws to suspend free speech, and which paved the way for them to basically eliminate all their political opponents, adopt a one-party state within 6 months of coming to power, and ultimately, of course, committing themselves to genocide and the extermination of Jews and total war. So I'm not arguing that if less censorship had been in place, Nazism could have been avoided. You know, there are lots of other factors that are in play, and some of them probably more important than the relationship between free speech and censorship. But I just don't see any good evidence for, you know, I think if you want to restrict free speech in open democracies, then the burden of proof should at least be on those who want to limit free speech, that those restrictions are necessary and proportionate and efficient in countering the dangers that you fear. And I just don't see the history of the Weimar Republic's collapse as one that supports that thesis. We also have social science research that suggests that there might actually countries that restrict free speech might be experiencing more violence. So if you try to limit what extremists can say, it might be easier for them to legitimize using violence because they're not allowed to say what they speak their minds. Then psychologically it's easier for you to justify resorting to violence. So those are some of the unintended consequences of free speech restrictions that might be a bit too complicated for politicians that just want to signal that they don't want to tolerate, hate speech or disinformation or extremism and want to do something about it. And what's the best thing you can do about it as a politician? Well, that is to ban it. And also, no one is really going to stand up for the rights of Nazis or extremists. Only very, very few people, especially in Europe, care that much about free speech to really stand up for principle. And that's how you can sort of gnaw away at free speech at the edges. And then if you continue doing that continuously for decades, then suddenly free speech has been severely compromised.
So at Steel Wheels on Twitter, I think he pretty much covered your question. He was asking about free speech in different European Union countries. I guess I would just ask which country has the most robust protections for free speech and the most kind of robust culture of free speech in Europe. Would that be Denmark?
I think Norway and Denmark might be the countries that though I think the last two governments we've had in Denmark have really made inroads, have undermined our tradition of sort of civil libertarian commitment to free speech. Norway has had courts that have been much more reluctant than most others to prohibit categories of hate speech and glorification of terrorism and such categories. Denmark is a special case. As I mentioned, we had the communists were members of parliament for a while. They had a headquarter in the center city. They had a newspaper funded by the Soviets, and you could run around with hammer and sickle if you wanted to, and you could also be openly a neo-Nazi. And in 1969, Denmark became the first country in the world to decriminalize porn. When it came to even in images, they decriminalized porn in writing, literature in 67. So that says something about sort of the liberality of the culture. And 69 is actually a very interesting year. It's also the year that the US Supreme Court made its decision in Brandenburg versus Ohio, which sets a very, very high bar for when you can prohibit speech, that it basically has to be sort of incitement to imminent lawless action that is also likely to occur. And it was also the year where a very brave soul at the BBC decided that Monty Python could be shown on British public tax funder paid television. And I still think that's a very, very brave decision given the content of Monty Python. So that might have been one of the sort of the high watermarks of free speech history.
All right, let me see, I'll take maybe one more from Facebook. Pasha Miller asks, what do you make of the social justice warriors who make the claim that speech is violence? And she's asking, where does this notion come from?
Well, it's actually a very old notion. You will see that even, you know, among those who were, or at least that, you know, speech translates into very direct, tangible harms. So, you know, someone like Thomas Aquinas, an eminent philosopher, writes that, you know, it's worse to permit heresy than a robber, because heresy destroys the soul and pollutes the community, and therefore it's right to execute a heretic who's an obstinate heretic. He should be given the chance to repent. If he refuses to do so, it's not only just, but it's right to execute that person. And there's a bit of the same in this idea that words are violence. And in many ways, I actually think that speech is the antithesis of violence. I think speech is absolutely necessary for us to live together despite our differences. So there was a time in European history, for instance, where, you know, if you denied the Holy Trinity, that if you denied that Jesus Christ was divine, that was seen as an existential threat to society, and people would literally try to kill you or you know, confront you physically. Today, in most Western countries, a lot of people might not even know what the Holy Trinity is, but they certainly would not think it a threat. And, you know, Catholics and Protestants can live side by side, and no one wants to kill the other or view it as a threat that they believe in a special way. And that is due to tolerance and free speech. And I think, you know, in everyday society, we have to compromise and be pragmatic in order to live together. Unless you're very, very rich and own your own island, you know, most of us will have to accommodate other people's various needs and so on, out of politeness and just for society to gel. But in order to reach compromise, in order to be pragmatic, I think we need radical free speech in order to, you know, to discuss our differences and come to some sort of solution. We need to be able to say everything. And that's what free speech really allows. So I think it's completely a misguided idea to treat free speech as violence. And, you know, it also begs the question, if there's no real difference between free speech and violence, you know, does that then mean that if you say something that I find is offensive, and I view it as a punch in the face, do I then have the right to punch you physically in the face? Is that the same thing? If you were to say something now, to me now that I thought was violent, you know, if we were sitting across from each other and I punch you in the face with a fist, would that then be, you know, oh, there's no real difference. You said something that offended me, I punched you in the face. Is that the same? I think most people in reality would say, no, that's actually not the same thing. And again, that does not mean that speech cannot lead to, you know, you couldn't organize a genocide, for instance, without using speech. We saw that in Rwanda with the radio. But again, that's also where you tend to have limits on free speech. So even the First Amendment would not protect the kind of speech that was disseminated on Radio Miltons in Rwanda, where they basically said, "I'll go out and hack your neighbors to death with machetes." Yeah. I don't know if that was
yeah. Well, that's almost a good place to end it. But I'm actually surprised that nobody asked this from our social media audience. So I will ask it to close us out. Of course, it's the big news aside from the Homeland Security Governance, Disinformation Governance Board. The much bigger news, I think actually the biggest news of the past couple of years is Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, with the explicit intentions to increase transparency and reduce censorship on the platform. Obviously, we're all talking about it here in the United States. Maybe it's not as big a deal over in Europe.
Oh,
But,
it is. Everyone's talking about it in Europe as well.
okay.
Yeah. So you know, I think there are various ways to look at it. One of the things, given the fact of Milton's curse, the fact that Elon Musk says that he will improve, he's committed to free speech, does not necessarily mean that he will be so in practice. And so there is, I think, good reasons to be skeptical of the world's richest man buying a platform like Twitter. Will he be open to, I think there have been stories before about him trying to suppress inconvenient news about Tesla and other things. So will he be open to being challenged? Will he be open to his businesses being dragged through the mud? Will he, if he invests in certain countries that don't like dissidents, will he continue to provide a platform for those? We don't know that because people tend to be flexible about their free speech principles when they're put on the spot. So is Elon Musk completely different from everyone else? We'll see. But I think it's also incredible to witness the reaction of so many politicians and journalists who make a living out of exercising free speech, but again, who take it completely for granted, sort of in complete meltdown about this news and about, no one knows how this will play out in reality, but they've already concluded that basically Twitter will be turned into a platform for neo-Nazis and Russian disinformation. And then there's sort of the take that I think it will be very difficult for Elon Musk to go back to the early days of techno-utopian free speech maximalism of the 1990s, just because a lot of users will not want to do that. And so if you lose a lot of users, if you lose advertisers, and you've just spent 45 billion, you might be the richest man in the world, but I'm assuming that you actually also want to make a dime of that investment. And also laws in Europe, if you want to operate in Europe, you're obliged soon by this Digital Services Act to remove certain types of illegal content. So, if Twitter wants to operate within Europe, they will have to adopt restrictive content moderation practices. And that's the so-called Brussels effect, which means that laws adopted in Europe tend to be sort of the default position of some of these platforms. So, which means it might have a spillover effect in the US. So Americans might be subject to sort of moderation without representation, if you like, due to laws passed in Brussels and Berlin.
All right. Well, I appreciate that nuanced kind of perspective on Elon Musk, because I agree. I think there have been so many of us, myself included, who've been so frustrated by what we've experienced as the really unfair and one-sided suppression of particular points of view. So this is not the savior. Let's reserve judgment. Let's be skeptical, but at least let's find some reasons to be optimistic and hopeful, because we could all use a little hope these days. So, Jakob, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Jack. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And thanks to all of you who joined us. Go out right now, buy this book, Free Speech, The History from Socrates to Social Media. As I'm a total audiobook addict, and 5 stars aren't enough for me to rate the audiobook version of Jakob's Free Speech book. It was really well done, so check it out. And we can follow Jakob on Twitter. It's just with his name. And any place else, Jakob, that we should be following you, or how can we help you? I'm
sort of old-fashioned. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. Still struggling with Instagram. That's how old school I am.
Your kids will be able to help you any day now.
but they're I think my daughter is like mostly TikTok, and that's not for me.
A bridge too far.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hey, join me later on today. I've got a clubhouse with our senior scholar, Professor Stephen Hicks. It's going to be an Ask Me Anything on philosophy, tomorrow we've got a clubhouse with another senior scholar at the Atlas Society, Professor Richard Salzman. And next week, I'm going to have a very interesting the Atlas Society Asks. As some of you may recall, we had the feminist Kara Dansky on a few months ago, voicing her concerns about certain aspects of the transgender activist agenda. And so I want to make sure that we are taking in different perspectives. So I'm going to have Buck Angel. He is a transgender man, so born a woman, living as a man. And we're going to get some different perspectives in terms of what it's like to come to the realization that you don't feel like you fit well in your body, and how he sees the current kind of battle over parents' rights, individual rights, and acceptance for people pursuing their own unique identities. So thanks very much. See you